Hello, my friends, and welcome to Fishtory. I am Alexander Williamson, of course, your host, and we are in episode 206 of Fishtory, the audio-based show in which I update you on news about ornamental and just overall anything tangentially related to the aquarium and freshwater or brackish ecology world, everything out there that may be interesting to you nature and fish lovers. And unlike most episodes where I try to put lots of information on the screen, this is one you can listen to on your way to work, or you can listen to while you're doing your water changes or whatever it may be. And if you want to watch, it'll either be me or images of fish and or maybe some related graphics that I may put up from time to time. But for the most part, it'll be all covered verbally so that nobody listening is missing any of the crucial information. So let's jump right in, and today we are going to be talking about nanoplastics, a very, very troubling new frontier of scientific research and of global concern that we need to start talking about a whole lot more. Because the genie is out of the lamp, the cat is out of the bag, and things are already bad. New research that just came out on September 26th in Sweden from Lund University, from a team of researchers there, found that at the current ambient level that we find these nanoplastics. And nanoplastics, let me say first with an aside, they are any type of plastic that is found under 1,000 nanometers in size. So they're very, very small, smaller than you can see with the eye, much smaller than a human hair is wide, for instance, even. And these little particles are finding their way into cells of living creatures. They are also finding their way into the stomachs and then the digestive system, and then oftentimes now we're learning not only are they making themselves at home in, say, the liver or the kidneys, where the constituent chemicals that make up these plastic compounds breaks down over time. It breaks down due to UV exposure. It breaks down due to acidic or basic exposure, and just due to time and water and all sorts of other chemical reactions that go on naturally on this planet. But being digested is a quick way for this to happen, and it is a way that oftentimes when this occurs, it makes its way into the cells of creatures. Now, we've known that ingesting the plastic particles by eating other creatures that have plastic in them was an issue, and this is usually studied and referred to as microplastics. But we are talking today about the nanoplastics, and as I mentioned, that's under 1,000 nanometers in size, and specifically, we're looking at more around the under 100 nanometers in size. Pieces of debris and little molecules that can wedge themselves into single-celled organisms, into bacteria or cyanobacteria, into zooplankton or amoeba even, and disrupt the cellular function going on there. Now, we've done enough research to know that things like PET, various vinyls and various plastics have an impact on cells. They can damage DNA at the nucleus of the cell, and they can also disrupt the mitochondrial part of a cell, which is the energy or powerhouse production point in cells. And these can become essentially clogged, or they can become confused by the plastics, and they can give out incorrect signals and information. And oftentimes these plastics can be damaging to a cell membrane or wall in an organism just on its own. But even more troubling is the even teenier chemicals and compounds get into the cell, and then they cause the cell to start giving haywire orders and almost act as a hormone or as a neurotransmitter, or rather something that disrupts either one of those pathways. And it can often cause the cell membrane to do things like open up and flood the cell, or cause the cell to swell with water or other substances, take on salts until it bursts and is destroyed. And this going on all throughout an organism can lead to cell death. It can lead to organ failure. And in the case of single-celled organisms or very simple organisms, it can cause the death of that bacteria, that fungi, or that early simple life form. It can just die directly due to the toxicity of these nanoplastics themselves. So unlike the research they've done in the past where they're looking at what are the potential complications of living with plastics in our gut or in a liver or in a kidney, where they get sequestered and what we call bioaccumulated or stacked up over time, we're specifically now talking about the impact of these plastics moving through the food chain in the span of one organism's lifetime as well. So it may be that they're eating things and that they're taking on these plastics, but some of these are so small that they're entering through the pores of things. They're entering through the skin, they're entering through membranes, or they're entering as water or even air is breathed in as dust particles or as debris. And whereas usually mucous membranes and other, things like biofilm or slime coats would protect various creatures, amphibians and fish, reptiles and the like, these are finding their way through these mucuses and things straight into the skin, into the cells, into the body, and penetrating deeper and deeper over the course of one organism's lifetime, which is indeed very troubling. Now, another thing that is extremely troubling is a new research paper that determined an average microplastic content for all spaces on Earth. And when they set out to do this research, they went all over the world, from the tops of mountains in alpine and, tundra-like conditions, almost Arctic-like conditions, all the way to the actual Arctic poles, and sampling ice and snow and sampling soil and plants and water all around the world, from the equators to the doldrums, all the way to the poles, as I just said, and basically came up with a number that represents how many parts per billion are plastic in the average environment. And they have established this a number of ways and had a number of answers. And places like the poles, for instance, the density of the ice that exists there are parts of it in the very heart of a glacier, for instance, or even dozens of feet into a glacier, that these microplastics generally aren't going to be penetrating yet. But in some surprising cases, we're seeing them coming out of things like undersea vents, or out of, water sources in hydrothermal vents and caves that clearly have never been entered by humans, let alone plastic trash. So these things are making their way into even the smallest life forms, bacteria, like I said, cyanobacteria, fungi, little insects, and small plankton, and they're getting all over the world. And with a century plus now of plastics existing, it's starting to add up. And now they are finding something like 7 parts per billion on average in the world. If you just enter a cubic meter of space, that's what you're apt to find. And that's averaging with the glaciers and things. Now, people would say that this is not necessarily a useful number because it was also sampling air. It was sampling deep under the oceans. It was sampling in crowded cities. So some places you have literally most of the particles, a majority of them, actually being a plastic in their original source, and in other places, very few, if any. And that throws an average off quite a bit. So a more useful working number is essentially non-frozen water. So over 0 Celsius, under 100 Celsius, which would be boiling water. We're essentially talking about 32 Fahrenheit up to 212 Fahrenheit. That we're talking about here. So not necessarily in the hydrothermal vents that are boiling, but when we're talking about the spaces on Earth that allow for life, the spaces that are oxygen rich as well. And that can be problematic in that some people say, well, you need to account for anoxic locations as well. And that is true in that there are a lot of nanoplastics being found now, even in those locations, as I mentioned earlier. But when we look at locations where life would be sustained most likely in these areas of liquid water, we are seeing that the likelihood of plastics, even when you're out in the middle of nowhere, is high. It's high that we're actually going to find hundreds of particles of plastic, even if you're far, far from anything remotely human-made that's around. Even if you're digging into topsoil now, it has made its way all around our planet. It has made its way to the upper atmosphere and has made its way down into the vaults and the aqueducts and the large caverns and different systems that are the veins of our planet, unfortunately. So recently, a study out of Lund University found that the microplastics obviously were a problem in our oceans. And so they decided to look at the nanoplastics, the even smaller particles, and see what was going on in freshwater. And very interestingly there, they found that in freshwater, they did not find any cyanobacteria or any bacteria that was able to be harmed by the plastics. It was the nanoplastic particles seemed to be present, but they did not seem to be harming the life forms in any meaningful way or reducing its abundance, cyanobacteria, and a number of oxygen or gram-positive bacteria they studied. Now, in some cases, they've actually found bacteria that have evolved so quickly over the last 100 years or so that in Japan, for instance, they have a known bacteria by the species name of Ruber that is known to actually eat and break down these plastic nanoparticles and these plastic microparticles. And on the microparticles, it's able to basically grow on them and essentially melt them into constituent chemicals and then break those apart as well. We also know that fungi in the form of oyster mushrooms are known to break down hydrocarbons through their mycelium. Paul Stamets has done work for this out of Olympia, Washington. Also, we now are seeing that there is another mushroom found in New York, as well as in Calgary, that was found to have the ability to break down the plastics in their micro or in their nano forms. And that does give us hope that maybe this study just isn't far-reaching enough, that we found cyanobacteria that was going to actively destroy or dismantle the molecules that make up these plastic particles. But what they did find in this study, unfortunately, is that those nanoplastics are building up in life forms all throughout the food chain. And that, as I said, it's not throughout their entire lives bioaccumulating. It is literally entering the cell in the span of the organism, living its individual life. And these are causing all sorts of damage to everything from the cell itself and DNA to the actual function and larger systemic systems like vasculature, or like nerve conductivity, or even impulses for thoughts and motions like movement that travel along nerves, that they can be disrupted by these nanoplastics, and basically either giving false signals in between cells or losing signals altogether. So this is a very far-reaching and very problematic thing, and we're just beginning now to see what the consequences are. But unfortunately, what we're seeing in fresh water is that the eutrophication zones that we know have been problematic due to spiked levels in everything from fertilizer to phosphates, that the industrial agricultural revolution of the 20th century caused, not only did it allow us to feed millions, if not billions, of extra people around the world and have ground that is far more fertile, but it runs off into our oceans and lakes. And now we have an abundance of nitrogen in the form of whether it's ammonia or ammonium nitrate or nitrites or nitrates. It's all causing issues that were not present in the density or in the abundance that they were over 150 years ago, before the industrial and agricultural revolutions we have seen, where we figured out how to fixate nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Remembering that 70% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, yet living organisms cannot use it for the most part, other than some bacteria and or some fungi that are working in conjunction with bacteria, let alone some plants like legumes that work with bacteria or fungi in a mycorrhizal network and exchange nutrients for that nitrogen as a food source. And oftentimes they're trading sugar, or they're trading, sulfur or phosphates or some other compound that is needed in a mutual or symbiotic relationship. So the impact of this reaching into our freshwater ecosystems hadn't been studied as much, because we think of the trash and the debris washing out into the oceans of the world and causing things like the great trash gyre out in the middle of the Pacific. But what we're learning now is that these microplastics are making their way all the way up the food web, and it isn't taking the ingestion of active food web participants. So it's not taking a big fish eating a medium fish that ate a little fish that ate plankton. They're finding that the plankton itself is dying from these plastics, that there's some of that going on, and there's also some of the plankton is just building up plastics. And so then when a fish eats it, it builds up plastics even more and bioaccumulates it in that traditional way. But the fact that it's actually killing organisms at the bottom of the food chain all the way up through the top of the food chain is incredibly disturbing. And it really has scientists shook around the world right now, trying to decide what are reasonable regulations, what is a reasonable course of action. Undoubtedly, plastics have changed the world for the better in many, many ways. Everything from sanitization and medical things that just would not be possible without plastics, and food storage. I mean, there are countless things, from technology and everyday items for you and I, to the phone or TV you're watching this on, to industrial and to everyday consumer goods. Plastics have undoubtedly changed life for the better in many ways. However, is plastic forever? Well, not forever in a universal time scale, but in a species time scale, we're seeing that it has actually been shown to wipe out whole species of zooplankton in this study when they made an artificial wetland, essentially, and they used endemic species of zooplankton and creatures like Daphnia. They found that these nanoparticles at around 44 nanometers or smaller, that they're getting through the cell membranes. They're causing chaos in the cells of these organisms, and they're literally killing them before they even have time to bioaccumulate them through ingesting them. So this is big news, and it is also very disturbing that we are finding these plastics all around our ecosystem and world, whether it's next to an industrial plastic manufacturer or whether it's some remote forest up in Russia. It, to a certain degree, may not matter. You could find pockets of very intense, dense amounts of these nanoplastics that are brought there because a certain bacteria or a certain fungi or small organism is ingesting something that has a high affinity to it. And now we're trying to understand which organisms those are, and if there are any things like bacteria, archaea, or cyanobacteria that can dismantle these nano-sized molecules and toxins and chemicals from plastics, rather than just the larger chunks where we've seen larger plastic pieces in the ocean, for instance, being broken down and eroded and broken down until they're small enough that they're not seen anymore. But it may be that we are only now seeing the most dangerous impact of this process in the nanoplastics and in this scale, when they're able to actually invade and disrupt cells in a creature's lifetime. So I will keep you updated on this. Undoubtedly, this will have massive implications. I mean, everything from the limits of food that people should consume. Probably pregnant women and people with immune disorders will be most vulnerable first, and then it will probably be children and growing children that will next be warned, and then the general population if it is like other issues that we've seen like this. Now, this could be one of the great issues of the 21st century, and trying to figure out how to somehow get the genie back in the box. And despite such good intentions of doing things like plastic cleanup and reclamation and then burying it, unless we can disarticulate it at the molecular level, it may be all for naught if it still is making its way into the bacteria, into the archaea, into flies, and into various creatures that swim, fly, walk, crawl, you name it, and end up in every part of this earth that we call home. Thank you for watching, and thanks for sticking around for a long episode. I do appreciate it. If you like this long form content, covers a couple news articles put into one issue, let me know, and leave a comment. It really does help, and a thumbs up, that also helps. Also, if you're not subscribed and you'd like to be, come on and join us. Also, there's a Discord called Fishtory, ! As well, and you can come find us there and make yourself right at home, as well as check out all the perks of being a channel member or community member. We've got all sorts of discounts and things in the description doobly-doo down below. I hope y'all have a great day, and hopefully something can inspire us all to think of solutions rather than to dwell on this unfortunate news I had to break to y'all today. All right, guys, I'll see you next time. Take care and be well. Bye.